It's my great pleasure to introduce to you my dear colleague, Alison Taciturn. Alison is Professor of Feminist Philosophy here at UWE. She is a very accomplished scholar of Kant and Kierkegaard, and that's what she's going to talk about today. And she's also published very widely on political theory, political philosophy, well, political theory and political philosophy. I'll just mention her most recent book, which is titled Unfinished Selves, Kierkegaard, Metaphysics, and Political Theory, which was 2009 from Continuum. Alison, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Darian. Okay, well, I'm afraid an extra word has appeared in my title that you might not have seen from the abstract and from the programme, and that's this little word Kierkegaard. He happens to be a person. It's not just a word, he's a person. Harvey asked me, when she asked me if I'd talk at this, which I felt very honoured, and of course, thank you, Harvey, to be asked to speak at this, and she asked me if I'd give a paper on Kant, and maybe everything in the end stems from Kant, so that is a good idea to have at least one paper on Kant. But I'm also obsessed with Kierkegaard, so I couldn't avoid, when I started thinking about Kant and the problem of freedom and evil, I wanted to bring in Kierkegaard as well. And I just want to say at the beginning, does this have anything to do with naturalism? The paper, I think, is a paper in speculative naturalism, so it may be convincing to no one, but I hope it'll at least be of interest to someone here. Does it have any relevance to phenomenology? Well, I did find out that apparently Husserl, towards the end of his life, discovered Kierkegaard and found Kierkegaard, as he thought, to be absolutely wonderful, and he told all his students that they ought to read him. So I don't know whether that shows there's any relevance at all or not, but that'll be up for you to work out. Now, there's a book by a guy called Ronald Green, which is called Kierkegaard and Kant, The Hidden Debt. And Ronald Green argues that there are many more similarities between Kierkegaard and Kant than is usually assumed to be the case. And indeed, than most commentators suggest is the case. One deep similarity Green points to between Kierkegaard and Kant is that he suggests that both have a passion, or indeed an obsession, with the notion of freedom. Kierkegaard, in his journal entries, expresses a passion for human freedom. And I think that both of them have in mind a very strong libertarian sense of freedom. What I want to do in this paper is to look at what is seen to be, by many scholars, a problem in Kant's notion of freedom, and that is the problem that it's difficult for Kant, so many people argue, to account for the notion of freely doing wrong. And I think this is actually connected with a view that Kant holds, which is that sin or wrongdoing or evil is inexplicable. Kant thinks that sin or evil is actually inexplicable. And he's mainly concerned, or Kant is very preoccupied with this issue in his late work, Religion Within the Limits of Mere Reason Alone. And actually, and a number of commentators apart from me, I spotted this, and then I thought, oh my God, everybody else has spotted it too. But Kierkegaard's concept of anxiety is actually very close to Kant's text with Religion Within the Limits of Mere Reason Alone. And I think that Kierkegaard is actually attempting to respond to some of Kant's arguments in that work, Religion, in his text, Concept of Anxiety. And so I actually think that sin is indeed, this character Green makes the point that sin is inexplicable for both Kant and Kierkegaard. And I want to argue that it is indeed inexplicable for Kant, but not for Kierkegaard. But the way I'm going to argue this is in terms of a view that some of you might think is completely implausible, but I don't know. I'll try to give a few reasons why we might want to believe it. And that's in terms of a form of metaphysical or speculative naturalism, which I think Kierkegaard actually adopts, despite the view that's often attributed to him by many commentators. So the first thing that I want to do then in the paper is to consider three readings in Kant and in Kantian scholarship on the relationship between freedom and the moral law, or the free will and the moral law. Some of these interpretations come from this text, religion. Now, there's one interpretation of this relation, the relation between freedom and the moral law, which Kant gives in Critique of the Practical Reason and in the Groundwork, where he suggests that this link is very strong. The moral law, he wrote, is a law of causality through freedom. Some indeed, one of Kant's contemporaries, a guy called Carl Schmitt, had suggested that at least sometimes Kant makes the link between these two so strong that he effectively became an intelligible fatalist. And that view was one that preoccupied Kant. His references indeed to the holy will suggest this kind of reading. And he intends this notion of the holy will to be a description of the finite rational will insofar as it operates intelligibly. But obviously, according to this interpretation, given that the self viewed as intelligible agent must be seen as perfectly moral, one is free if and only if one follows the moral law. And an obvious problem with this interpretation is that immoral agents fail to be free. And Kant himself, I think, recognized that this was a potential problem in his thinking, and he dealt with this, or he was preoccupied with this issue, particularly in this text, religion. So in order to avoid the fatalist interpretation of the link between the moral law and the free will, then, Kant hypothesizes an inner self, a disposition that chooses on occasion to subordinate the moral law to something else. In this text, religion within the limits of mere reason alone, Kant gives a number of possible readings which are compatible with this interpretation of what happens when a person does wrong. For example, he writes, quote, "The ground of evil cannot lie in any object determining the power of choice through inclination, nor in any natural impulses, but only in a rule that the power of choice itself produces for the exercise of its freedom," i.e. a maxim. But what is this rule? He describes some predispositions which do not allow for freedom. So, for example, there are predispositions to animality, there are merely mechanical self-love, there are predispositions to self-preservation, the desire for propagation, and the social drive. But then he mentions acting from maxims that are impure. They are partially moral and partially not. So one view then is that wrongdoing, one view which is actually not very often discussed by Kantian commentators because it's actually quite a wild view, wrongdoing is actually freely undertaken but grounded in some other force outside time and space than the moral law. And I'd just like to mention this interpretation because it seems to me to be interesting for the speculative Kierkegaardian reading I want to give in a minute. When he's criticising the Stoic view that evil consists in the mere lack of knowledge of what is good, Kant writes, quote, "We should not be surprised if an apostle represents this invisible enemy as indeed an evil spirit. It's all the same to us, so far as this practical use is concerned, whether we locate the tempter simply in ourselves or also outside us, for guilt teaches us not any the less in the latter case than in the former, insomuch as we would not be tempted by him," this is the evil demon, "if we were not in secret agreement with him." So, famously, Kant offers, in the third critique, a moral proof of the existence of God. When we act freely from the moral law, we're acting as though we are pure rational beings. And this is, Kant, to quote Kant, the idea of the supersensible within us. And this gives rise to an idea of the supersensible outside us, a supersensible being that grounds morality in nature. So the supreme being, then, is conceived by our analogy with our own supersensible capacity, the capacity to act freely in accordance with the moral law. Correspondingly, Kant hypothesizes, according to this reading, a spirit of an originally more sublime destiny that tempts human beings into evil. He writes that the absolutely first beginnings of evil, as with the first beginnings of good, are incomprehensible to we finite limited beings. Now actually, weirdly, there's a distinct advantage of this interpretation. It provides evidence of genuine metaphysical or transcendental freedom to do wrong. But there are, however, a number of disadvantages with it. Firstly, it would undermine the crucial argument of the second critique that freedom and the moral law reciprocally imply one another. Some free acts would be grounded in some other source, unfathomable source, whilst free and moral acts are grounded in pure reason and the moral law. And a second objection is that, as one commentator has put it, quote, devilishness would mark the limit point beyond which no moral regeneration would be possible. So according to this reading, devilishness would remove altogether our moral capacity. So freely willing to reject the moral law would mean exercising reason for the sake of being irrational. So perhaps the difficulties with this reading in the end stem from the radical separation of the moral self from the phenomenal causally determined self. Now, a third possible reading that I want to consider, and this is the one that most contemporary analytic commentators have taken seriously, really develops this notion of a disposition that I referred to earlier. I'll shout and then I can exert my power over this natural object out there that can't really stop me from talking. So a number of contemporary commentators then have offered alternative interpretations of freely doing wrong that fits with this notion referred to in religion of a disposition to choose a maxim. Now this is literally just a summary of the paper by the way here. One commentator, Michelson, calls this, quote, a disposition to subordinate within a maxim the moral law to some sensuous inclination. And I find this interpretation in a number of commentators. Alenka Zupančič as a kind of Žižekian, but also in Kierkegaard, O'Neill, in Alan Wood and others. Now there's a number of difficulties that have been pointed to if you adopt a kind of metaphysical reading of this notion, however. One is that if the free will is a purely intelligible faculty not subject to the form of time, nor consequently to the condition of succession in time, how can Kant make sense of moral change or moral conversion? And Louis Whitebeck wrote, if the soul, the rational self, is not subject to temporal conditions, how are we make sense of the notion, which is clearly in Kant, of endless progress? And of course there's also the point that the notion seems to commit Kant to at least two selves too many. There's the phenomenal and the noumenal self, but then there's also this disposition to choose one self or the other. Now, it might be suggested, and this is what commentators like Kierkegaard and O'Neill and Alan Wood have done, that you can remove this implausible metaphysic from Kant's theory. So Alan Wood, for example, I'm just going to mention his interpretation and outline what seemed to me to be a few difficulties with it. So Alan Wood, for example, then suggests a reconstruction of Kant that focuses on practical freedom as opposed to metaphysical freedom. He suggests that freedom is the capacity to act according to rational norms. In acting freely, the agent is acting from a special kind of causality. A will acts not only according to laws, but, quote, according to their representation. That's a quote from Wood. The law of a free cause must be one it represents to itself. So the free self on this reading then is a disposition to choose some law or other, and it might choose the moral law or it might choose something else. The law is one under which it considers its actions from a practical standpoint. And Wood famously draws the analogy of a chess player. He or she moves the bishop in accordance with the rules of chess. The explanation of the agent's action will be in terms of the agent's intentions. So freedom on this view would not be either causally or descriptively related to the will. Rather, freedom would be some notion that may be inexplicable, but that involves the ability to choose either to subordinate the moral law to something else or to follow the moral law. So the rules of morality then operate rather like the rules of chess. They're rules that we must presuppose, though, rather like the rules of logic, in order to act rationally. Wood suggests, and Honora O'Neill makes a similar point, that we must presuppose freedom in representing ourselves as competent to decide between compatibilism and incompatibilism, or indeed between naturalism and some non-natural version of phenomenology. But there seem to me, though, to be parallel difficulties with this revised notion. Let's look at the chess player analogy. The freedom to do wrong could be viewed by analogy either as failing properly to move one's bishop, if you are moving your bishop, of course, or as failing to play at all. It's difficult, though, to regard either of these actions as properly free in the sense in which the chess player who plays the bishop according to the rules is indeed free. When a chess player fails to move the bishop properly, the player is trying to move it correctly, but failing. But it might involve some contorted thinking to describe Hitler's actions, for example, as involving him trying hard to follow the moral law, but failing. In fact, wrongdoing on the chess player analogy would be simply failing to act properly within the rules of the game, or failing to fall within the domain of chess or morality at all. And so the action then would not be imputable. Moreover, this kind of explanation that's offered by several commentators seems to leave Kant open to the charge that he's using a sleight of hand, both suggesting that actions governed by sensuous inclination are fully determined, but also arguing that the will can choose to subordinate the moral law to sensuous inclination. To offer analogy, if I simply smoke a cigarette, I'm acting from inclination. But if I reflect on this and decide to subordinate the maximum that considers the consequence of smoking to my desire, then my action is free. Using Frankfurt's notion of first and second order desire, I might carefully consider the second order desire, but still act on my first order desire. The difficulty, though, is that the two actions are actually the same. Moreover, and finally on this point, Wood and O'Neill both make the point that we must presuppose our own freedom in representing ourselves as rational beings. But the fact that we must presuppose our freedom does not show that we are free. I might have to presuppose that I'm an excellent philosopher to talk to you, but that doesn't show that I am one. So I've outlined some difficulties, and you may not be convinced by any of them. Okay. Certainly if you're a convinced Kantian, you won't. But I've outlined some difficulties that seem to me to be inherent in various, but particularly in the disposition interpretation of Kant's notion of freedom. And it may be that these problems derive, as I said earlier, from his view of the self as essentially a divided thing. But it seems to me that his view is also connected with his claim that the origin of human evil, which is something that he also considers in his text Religion, is inscrutable, that it cannot be explained. So I just want to say a little bit about that before I move on to Kierkegaard. In this text, Religion, Kant argues that the first sin, the ultimate ground of the adoption of moral maxims, is inscrutable. Since, apart from the maxims, no determining ground can or ought to be adduced, we're led back endlessly in the series of determining grounds without ever being able to reach the ultimate ground. Our innermost wills are opaque to us. Knowing myself always to possess the ability to subordinate reason to impulse, this casts a pall over all my future free choices. And Kant rejects as inept the explanation of human evil that sees it as descending in inheritance from our first parents. Now, why for him is the Adam story inept? This is the account that he gives in Religion Within the Limits of Mere Reason Alone. Three reasons I want to give, or that I pick up from what Kant is claiming there. First of all, because it's set up to be in time, whereas the free will is not in time. Secondly, more importantly, because it doesn't explain what it purports to explain. It simply presupposes it. If we can resist temptation, then the story of Adam is no explanation of why we do wrong. If, on the other hand, evil is exterior, then seduction is impossible to resist. God therefore punishes us for something that's beyond our control. And this would be a classical determinist reading of the story. So Kant argues that the origin of evil therefore cannot be explained, and he suggests that it's somehow innate. Now, what I want to do in the next section of the paper is talk about Kierkegaard, and specifically about what I think he does in his work Concept of Anxiety, which is offer a response. And I'm going to give what I will describe as a speculative naturalist reading of Kierkegaard in the concept of anxiety, and suggest that Kierkegaard is actually, in this work, responding to Kant, and responding to this specific issue of Kant's, or this specific problem in Kant's theory, as he sees it. Now, Kant begins, perhaps in Enlightenment vein, with the link between freedom and the moral law. For him, in some way, freedom is freedom from domination by our passions. It's freedom to act in a way that controls passion. But this leaves him with two difficulties, perhaps, although you may not accept this, of course. He cannot ground evil, and it's very difficult for him to show how the self is free when it does wrong. Kierkegaard, by contrast, begins the concept of anxiety by attempting to account for wrongdoing or evil. Now, he has a picture of the self, I believe, as fundamentally a natural being like other natural objects. He writes, ethics begins with the actual. Human beings for Kierkegaard are, by contrast to Kant, and these words need explaining, but they are, he writes, a synthesis of the psyche and the body, but also a synthesis of the temporal and the eternal, a synthesis of the infinite and the finite. And this is very close to a claim of Schelling's, and I have to say that what I've learned about Schelling has come from my colleague Ian Grant. But it's close to a claim of Schelling's, to the effect that, quote, spirit is therefore neither finite nor infinite, but rather in it is the original unification of the finite and the infinite. So one thing I read from this is that human beings are natural living beings, but with a capacity both to reflect on their natures, as a very simple claim, but also to take up and to be guided by some moral ideal, or indeed not to be. It's in this sense that one might argue that they're infinite. They can reflect on the future, and they can be guided by an ideal that transcends their finitude. Now, Kierkegaard writes in Concept of Anxiety, quote, for ethics, the possibility of sin never occurs. He further writes, quote, ethics and dogmatics become radically confused. Now, there's no doubt that he has in mind here a critique of the Hegelian view that there are logical contradictions in reality. But he's also concerned throughout his works, although he's no doubt hugely influenced by Kant, to chastise Kantian ethics. He is furthermore sceptical about at least one of the Kantian notions of the self. For example, in the following formulation, quote from Kierkegaard again, the autonomous self is like a king without a country. Now, perhaps he has in mind here not only the noumenal, purely rational Kantian self, but also the self as disposition, as neither phenomenal nor noumenal. Kierkegaard writes further, quote, one can see how illogical the movements must be in logic, since the negative is the evil, and how unethical they must be in ethics. He offers a critique of the Socratic notion of sin, which is at the same time a critique of Kant. He says, in pure ideality, where the actual individual person is not involved, the transition is necessary. After all, in the system, everything takes place of necessity, or there is no difficulty at all connected with the transition from understanding to doing. This is the Greek mind. Now I'm going to come, and then he says, and the secret of modern philosophy is essentially the same. Cogito ergo sum, to think is to be. In the world of actuality, however, where the individual person is concerned, there is this tiny little transition from having understood to doing. And I want to come back to this point a bit later. Now, I think there are 2 points that Kierkegaard, at least 2 points that Kierkegaard is making in response to Kant. Firstly, the free will cannot be outside time because it would be unable to operate if it were so placed. If Adam, in the story of Adam, and now I want to give as I said, a naturalist, speculative naturalist reading of the story of Adam from Concept of Anxiety. If Adam is read as being wholly outside history, then the story, of course, cannot explain what it purports to explain. It will have no connection with we limited, finite beings. But secondly, although Kierkegaard would accept Kant's point that the notion of freedom of the will cannot be explained in either logical or mechanical causal terms, he would not accept the conclusion that this means that it cannot be explained at all. Now, here's where you might think, what on earth am I talking about? But anyway, I want to give you the account. Kant's difficulty in explaining the notion, according to Kierkegaard, stems ultimately from his radical separation of the free will from the finite natural phenomenal being, but it stems furthermore, I believe, in Kierkegaard's view, from Kant's restriction of nature to that which can be accessed by human phenomenal experience. And here's the speculative bit. Now, Zupančič made the point that Kant needs an infinitely existing body to be able to explain moral conversion, because of this point about the rational will. And she refers to de Sade. But Kierkegaard suggestively implies that the two notions, imaginary infinitely existing body and a perfectly rational will, stem from the same problematic assumptions, that the will and the body are radically separate. He talks in either or, Kierkegaard talks about Don Juan and the Kantian rational self, each embodying a form of determinism. One determined by the notion of a pure autonomous being, and the other by being pure body or pure sensuality. Adam is supposed then, according to the Christian tradition, and Kant also reads him this way, to be the reason why everyone else does wrong. He brought sin into the world. However, Kierkegaard writes that if we try to explain the story in the terms that speculative reason accepts, and in terms that Kant would accept, quote, every attempt to explain Adam's significance for the race confuses everything. He writes, is the concept of hereditary sin identical with the concept of the first sin, Adam's sin, the fall of man? On this reading, indeed, the existence of Adam doesn't explain anything. If Adam is inside the history of finite limited beings, then his sin is just like the sin of everyone else. If, on the other hand, he's placed wholly outside history, then he has no relation to everyone else's sin, precisely because he's placed outside the world. Adam's sin does not explain the sin of others if his sin is seen either as a first cause in a series of mechanical causes, or as a rational explanation for sin. However, according to my reading of Kierkegaard, Adam's sin explains the sin of others in a different way. In a criticism that's probably directed at Hegel but also at Kant, Kierkegaard writes, quote, let mathematicians and astronomers save themselves if they can with infinitely disappearing minute magnitudes, but in life itself, it doesn't help a man obtain his examination papers and much less explain spirit. He writes that the difficulty for the understanding for the Kantian framework is precisely that sin presupposes itself. And with his brilliant wit, Kierkegaard compares Kant's claims about Adam to the counting rhyme in which children delight. 1 tennis ball, 2 tennis balls, up to 9, and then tennis balls. Instead, Kierkegaard writes, by the first sin, sinfulness came into Adam. And the position is the same indeed for every other human being. The concepts with which Kantian reason deals belong in logic, whilst the notion of sin lies in ethics. Putting Kierkegaard into my words then, when a concept in logic is negated, the original concept is cancelled. Innocence, however, is a natural state of the natural being that may continue in existence. Innocence is ignorance. Kierkegaard's account then can be reconstructed to run as follows. In the biblical story, Adam, existing as a natural being, in a world of similarly constituted natural beings, existed. But Adam was neither free nor not free. Adam had no awareness of the possibility of choice. Eve, in some way a derived person, came into being later. She, via the serpent, seduced Adam. At that point, Adam became aware, through sensuality, of good and evil. By the first sin, sinfulness, or the capacity to reflect on our passions and desires, and to enact some and not others, in other words, freedom, came into Adam. Adam may have existed alongside other natural objects with their powers and capacities. These natural objects possessed powers and capacities that were akin to our human conceptual apparatus, but these powers and capacities were also different. The natural objects existing alongside Adam were not, in other words, purely inert mechanical things. For Kant, nature could not function as a causal ground of freedom for two reasons. Firstly, phenomenal nature is set up in opposition to freedom. Secondly, for Kant, nature is coextensive with the phenomenal experience of rational and finite beings. But for Kierkegaard, nature could function as the causal ground of freedom, for natural beings might both pre-exist in a temporal sense and exist in a spatial sense outside the domain of limited finite natural and rational beings. Adam, to reiterate, may have been simply part of a pre-existing nature. His existence in this fashion fits with the metaphysic which has nature operating as the ground of human action. An active nature with powers and capacities on this account pre-exists human reflective capacity. Adam then, on this reading, existed and acted, but in blissful ignorance of what he was doing. The reading I'm offering of the Adam story fits with a Schellingian-inspired influence on Kierkegaard. It's consistent with a picture according to which matter itself becomes, to quote from Ian Grant, matter itself becomes in some manner difficult to conceive of, capable of participation in the form of the understanding. Now, in innocence, human being is not, or man is not qualified as spirit. Human being or man is neither beast nor angel, neither animal nor rational. Kierkegaard outlines how the state of innocence in the Garden of Eden is precisely that. There's no knowledge of good and evil. Adam cannot understand the prohibition. There's peace and repose. But what else is there? There's nothing. Nothing has the effect of producing anxiety. And anxiety, according to him, then, is, quote, freedom's actuality as the possibility of possibility. So man, as I've said earlier, according to Kierkegaard, is a synthesis of the psychic and the physical. Anxiety, then, according to the story, passes into Adam as the possibility of being able. Now, I'm just going to, I think I'm just going to give one other little bit of information about Kant, and then I'm going to give three reasons. They're not fully formed arguments, but there are reasons why we might want to believe this story. So just to go back to return to Kant for a minute, because when Kant does, in his work Conjectural Beginning of Human History, when he does write about the origin of freedom, he prioritizes, as one would expect, reason. Freedom comes about, according to him, from someone he goes back to the story of Adam in the garden, for someone in the garden seeing two fruits and choosing between them. But this version of the story, though, presupposes the very thing it's setting out to explain, freedom, which is no doubt why Kant ultimately came to regard the origin of sin as being inexplicable. For Kierkegaard, instead, the moment spirit enters into Adam, it must posit also, since the human is the synthesis of the psychic and the bodily, its antithesis in the sensual, and the most extreme form of the sensuous is the sexual. Adam was beguiled by Eve, who was more sensuous and therefore more anxious than him. Eve has the capacity to propagate the race. Okay, now, why should any of us believe, why should we believe any of this? It's a myth. Why should we believe it? It's a speculative myth. I'm going to give three reasons why I think it's worth taking seriously. The first is just to go back to Kant. On a Kantian view, the burden of guilt becomes debilitating. Kant finds difficulty explaining free but wrong actions, partly because of his over-separation of the rational from the sensuous, but also because of his restriction of nature to the phenomenal, mechanical in nature experienced by we finite and limited beings. He ends up, as we've seen, as explaining sin, or he just says it's incomprehensible, he sometimes says it's innate in all of us, and it constantly tempts us away from the moral law. For Kierkegaard, though, as free and finite rational beings, we're continually both rational and sensuous. We're free to choose the good in terms of the love, in his case, that comes from sensuality, but that can be generalized beyond this, or we're free to choose the bad. But two other reasons I'd just like to give why we might want to take this story seriously. The first is that I think if you are the sort of philosopher who wants to rely on first-person experience to characterize mental states of various kinds, but crucially presupposing the notion of freedom, it's very difficult if you only focus on first-person experience, as I think Kierkegaard wrote when he was criticizing Descartes, which he does quite often. I can come back to how he does this in a moment if you'd like me to. It's very difficult for such a person to give an account of the very thing that's presupposed in order to make conceptual rational capacities possible. On the account that I'm suggesting, the thing that becomes very difficult to explain on that perspective is given some kind of explanation. Secondly, if you are some kind of a naturalist, why not be a naturalist all the way down? A naturalist that actually, rather than attempting to convert mental capacities into cognitive behavioural states, why not say you're a naturalist all the way down and you can give us some kind of natural explanation of phenomenal mental capacities. Second reason. Third reason, which has been mentioned by others, but it's maybe not strong enough, I don't know, but third reason is why should you take the natural to be exhausted by what contemporary science happens to tell us is the case? Why shouldn't we have a deeper form of naturalism, which is in the end, which is physical naturalism, that at least allows the possibility for a science that may be invented by some new kind of being at some point in the future, actually to explain if you like, the core mental capacity, which seems to me to be what is presupposed in order to be able to to choose between options at all, which is the capacity of freedom. So I'm going to stop.
Thank you. So we have plenty of time for questions. Well, plenty of time. We have about 15 minutes for questions. Well,
like you, I have been reading a lot of Kierkegaard recently.
Oh.
And so I suppose really it's quite a really very broad question really. Is until I listened to your paper, I never would have associated Kierkegaard with any kind of naturalism.
No, most people don't.
So I suppose I'm just trying to get to the heart of that. One thing I think maybe is that you're expanding the meaning of naturalism. So you're giving it a certain kind of definition, such that you couldn't include something like Kierkegaard. And that's I think from your last remarks that might be the case when you refer to a kind of metaphysical naturalism. Or it might be that you think certain, let's say, it's called for generic reasons, certain existentialist readings of Kierkegaard are simply just mistaken about Kierkegaard. So one is, if you like, that we've misunderstood Kierkegaard, so it might be just almost textual in that sense, whereas the other one is more speculative, that we can include Kierkegaard within a certain kind of naturalism if we change the way we think about
it. I don't know if everyone can hear, but either I'm expanding the notion of naturalism or everybody else has misunderstood Kierkegaard. And I think both are true, actually. I mean, I think it's partly, the misunderstanding is partly because Kierkegaard, as those of you who've read him, I'm sure everybody here has read something by Kierkegaard. He writes in a very literary way, and I mean, as most people here will know, Russell didn't even include him in the history of Western philosophy because he wasn't regarded as a philosopher. And I think it's only very recently that philosophers, and there are philosophers now who are beginning to take him very seriously, and he's not any longer only studied by people in religious studies departments or by theologians. And I think he has, I mean, maybe it's true that you can read him in lots of different ways because he doesn't write in the form of clear arguments that are structured, and you can say premise 2 is definitely doesn't follow from premise 1 or premise 2 is false. He doesn't write like that, so you can maybe read lots of things into him. And he is definitely, there is no doubt that he's a Christian, but I don't think that the claim is he's an irrational fideist is right, and that's what a lot of people have said about him. He's an irrational fideist, he just thinks God is the answer to everything. And I think, actually, and this is quite an important point, I think he has a lot of arguments, particularly in the works that he wrote under his own name, against theological voluntarism. And that's despite the view that a lot of commentators on Kierkegaard who claim that he is just simply a theological voluntarist. I don't think he is. I think that's absolutely wrong. I think he has a lot of arguments that you can mine from his texts that are against that. But on your other point, yeah, I am extending the notion of naturalism, but I don't think in a way that is completely unconnected with what Kierkegaard is saying in his texts. He did, there's a book by Michel Koch, I don't know if any of you know it, which is called, the title is Kant, Schelling and Kierkegaard. And she, amongst others, but I think, I don't know whether she's the first or not, she's done quite a lot of work on Schelling's influence on Kierkegaard. I mean, lots of people have done work on Kant's influence, but she has done quite a lot of work on that. And Kierkegaard attended Schelling's lectures in Berlin in the 1830s. And he said at first, I think Schelling has all the answers to all this Kantian, this Kantian nonsense. And then very soon afterwards, he said, "Oh, this Schelling, I can't stand him." And he wants to give a more, what might be described as a more phenomenologically persuasive picture of a kind of form of speculative materialism, which I think he does indeed get from, or speculative naturalism, which he does indeed get from Schelling, partly.
Ian? Alison, you touched upon, towards the end there, the idea that perhaps there might be some days of scientists, etc.
Perhaps there might be what?
Perhaps one day there might be some new kind of scientist, and then moved on to a new kind of species. So I was quite interested in this. It brought to mind an odd coincidence from which a certain consequence follows, which I think touches quite deeply on one of the themes which, although I think implicit in the conference in general, has not really been addressed. And that theme concerns the genesis of subjectivity. So I was thinking when you said that this echoed exactly what Schelling said in 1830, Einführung in die Philosophie, he's given us a series of lectures. He says, the changes in science require a change in subjectivity. Great changes in science require a change of organs. And the echo that had for me was Patricia Churchland's The Conclusion of Neurophilosophy, when she writes, "And so it is that the brain watches the brain and is changed forever by virtue of by the knowledge gained about what it is that brains do when they're doing what brains do." This question really raises an issue of the constitution of subjectivity, something that we have, or that many philosophers do try to take as a simple given in the world. This suggests a way of doing it such that subjectivity is consequent upon changes in the world. Naturalistic ones, absolutely, in precisely the extended sense you suggest. But nevertheless, naturalistic, and it's because of that naturalism, that therefore these productions of subjectivity must be consequent. I was wondering if you had anything like that in mind when you were thinking about it, were you thinking about the genesis of subjectivity?
Well, it is obviously speculative, but I mean, I suppose in a way, everything that we do is in some way speculative. I mean, when we're talking about cognitive science, for example, we're not actually sitting there doing the experiments and actually showing that this view is right, or that we hope we're producing really, really good arguments, of course. And I am making it's a myth, but I'm talking about a myth. And I'm making speculative, naturalist, metaphysical claims from a myth. But I think the myth, the argument would be, why not, if you believe in evolutionary theory, why not believe, and this is really speculative, but why not believe that at some point it might not be possible to explain in an evolutionary way basic and fundamental human mental capacities, and even the presupposition. I mean, freedom is, after all, the presupposition of the possibility of thinking rationally. It might even be possible to explain that. I mean, I think the paradox, and this is the paradox that I think Kierkegaard would certainly articulate, is that you're trying to do something which in a way you can't do, within a kind of causal framework. And you might say, well, he's just adopting a sleight of hand by extending the causal framework to something which is outside the limits of finite rational beings. And, you know, that's kind of just like hypothesizing, postulating something. For the sake of providing an explanation, you've provided no independent evidence that there is such a thing. So it's open to that kind of problem. But I think Kierkegaard, one of the things that Kierkegaard is, I mean, I'd like to just make the point about Descartes, because I think this is relevant, that Kierkegaard constantly, he doesn't give a clear, watertight journal philosophy paper showing what's wrong with Descartes' cogito. But he says things like, Descartes was preoccupied with the problem of doubt and certainty. And Descartes says, I'm doubting everything, and eventually I can get to the certainty that at least I'm doubting, and therefore there must be something that I'm doubting. And Kierkegaard says, why should not doubt, therefore, be constitutive of thought? Descartes dared, at the same time he was doubting, he dared to act. He's sitting in his room in front of his fire, keeping warm, no doubt, as long as the fire was working. I mean, you know, it's hard when we have noises outside to concentrate. He had some food, no doubt. But he dared to act. Why not say, in conclusion, what he should have said, and Hannah Arendt, I think I've made this point to some people before, Hannah Arendt suggested that Kierkegaard had the deepest critique of Descartes, because he says, why not characterize doubt as a feature of thought then? And why do we constantly imagine that we can achieve, you know, at least a relative degree of certainty? And in a way, this is bringing that doubt right to the core. It's saying, look, at least I'm offering you something that I can't prove in the way that you would want me to prove it in the terms of contemporary science, but it cannot be proved in those terms. But why not hypothesize that there is a nature outside? At least it gives you an explanatory framework. There's a nature outside human rational capacities that could be the reason why those or the cause, could have brought those rational capacities into being. An evolutionary account, a genetic account of the possibility of freedom. Why not? I mean, I'm sure someone can easily shoot it down. But it's a possibility, it's a speculative possibility.
This question asks about Kierkegaard's attitude towards naturalism, and your remarks that there could be this future science which Kierkegaard left off. Found from Kierkegaard's notebooks and the Good Scientific Postscript, he complains about, he says that science is fine, he says, until it intrudes upon what he calls the sphere of spirit, roughly sort of moral and spiritual concerns. I remember he had remarked on the scientific gang going pernicious when they treat human beings like shells and stones. In that case, could Kierkegaard actually ever be a naturalist if he thinks that it's absolutely essential to have some supernatural aspects, religious, within which to ground human life? It would seem, if there was a future science which could accommodate the supernatural concerns he needs to accommodate the sphere of spirit, then he couldn't be a naturalist.
Well, I mean, I would just say, I mean, you always use all these words in different senses. I would just say it depends on what you mean by naturalism. I mean, you know, he does use expressions like that, but he also, particularly in the concept of anxiety, which I think is the key place where he's looking at this issue of the freedom to do wrong, as I said earlier, he does also use the notion of nature. He refers to nature frequently. And he doesn't mean, there's no doubt, he doesn't mean an inert mechanical nature. I'm sure that that is the case. But what is important for him is that there's something that transcends the experience of finite rational beings. That is important for him. But what it is, I think, is precisely what's open to question. And you know, most of, as you say, most of the commentators have said that what he means by it is the Christian God. And he was Christian, there's no doubt, and he uses a lot of Christian thinking to describe his moral theory. And he's very interested in love and how love can actually be used to build up an alternative moral theory to some of the others we know about. But I don't think I think it's a perfectly consistent reading of him to use a notion of nature, which is to describe what transcends the, if you like, our experience, as the natural, but it's a natural. And in a way, you could say I think you could find. I mean, I don't know whether this argument is actually there, but you could say he must have. It must be something which, in some way, is natural, because otherwise it couldn't give rise to this notion of freedom. It has to be in some way like us. It cannot be absolutely distinct from us. And I think that's very much in tune with what I read from him, rather than the claim that's often attributed to him that this thing that transcends us is radically and absolutely distinct from us.
Joanne?
Thank you. It sounds to me as though you're juxtaposing a phenomenology of anxiety to a phenomenology of certainty in order to bring out this question about the genesis of subjectivity. I wonder, first, I guess, whether that captures what you've been saying, and then, if so, what the stance would be from which one would seek to adjudicate or seek to bring into relation to each other the consequences of pursuing the analysis of subjectivity as a producer of phenomenology of certainty, by contrast to what the consequences would be of pursuing this phenomenology of anxiety. I mean, I'm taken by the idea, but I'm not quite sure what to do with it next.
Sorry, you're saying, Joanna, can I just try and put back to you, because I'm not sure if entirely understood. You're saying that I'm claiming that Kierkegaard is opposing a phenomenology of anxiety to a phenomenology of certainty, and that choosing the phenomenology, and I'm claiming, attributing to him a phenomenology of anxiety. Is that what you're saying?
Well, that would be one way of describing the manner in which the Kierkegaardian challenges one not just to a certain Descartes, but to a certain practice of scientificity.
Mm. Well, I suppose I think there are two different registers there are two different registers. I think there are two different registers in Kierkegaard. I think he's both questioning the epistemological notion of setting out to gain certainty about the world. He's both challenging that and saying, I mean, I don't think he's just a simple classical skeptic, but he's saying, look, in a way, the whole attempt to engage in that epistemological quest is a bit fruitless, because it's very likely that you'll never get where you want to go. And so, why start trying to find certainty when, you are by definition a limited, finite being? What makes you think that you can dare to get access to get certainty about anything? Why should you? You'd be God in a way. I mean, he's not. I don't think he's just a skeptic. I think he's just saying, look, let's look elsewhere. And so but he's also critical of, if you like, attempts to use that kind of language to think about issues that are about, if you like, there are ethical issues, but they're also about the presuppositions of the possibility of using conceptual capacities. You can't use that kind of language. But rather than saying, we're going to be either, as we've been, we're either going to be locked into our own personal experience, or we're going to be in some domain of science, or else we're going to be, and he does say that we're in the domain of paradox. He does think that these are kind of paradoxical questions. But rather than saying that, let's think in a different way. Let's just think about these issues in a different way. Let's just give it a go. I mean, and that's where the anxiety comes in, because, you just suddenly, whoa, you're free. You're free. You're free to make radical choices. You maybe never do. Most of us stand in rooms and talk to other people. But we are actually free to make radical choices.
Thank you, Alison. I think we'll all feel free now to go to lunch.